The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from December 13th, 2023. Susan Wands is in conversation with Sarah Relyea and Michael Bourne about the upheaval and gentrification of the Bay Area neighborhoods portrayed in their novels. They explore the clash between the old world of artists and dream makers and the new order of corporate fortune makers. The authors describe the journey of creating unlikely protagonists who must fight to belong to the new world order. This was a hybrid program recorded live and with a Zoom presenter. We had problems with the equipment at our venue and had to improvise with a single laptop, but the show went on with a fascinating and in-depth discussion. Enjoy the program. Our host, Susan Wands, is a writer, tarot reader, and actor, a co-chair of the NYC chapter of the Historical Novel Society. She helps produce monthly online book launches and author panels. In London, she has lectured at Watkins Books for their recorded author series at Atlantis Bookshop and Watkins Books in London, and lectures at the Haute Culture Berlin Festival on Tarot. Ms. Wands' writings have appeared in Art and Fiction, Kindred Spirits magazine, and the Irving Society journal First Night. Susan's first book in her series about Pamela Colman Smith, Magician and Fool, Book 1, Major Arcana series, is out by Spark Press. The second book, High Priestess and Empress, will be published in 2024. And Emperor and Hierophant, the third book in the series, is in final edits. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan and get my wine.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you're all here. This is going to be a really interesting event. We are introducing two authors who have written historical novels that are based in the Bay Area. The name of this event tonight is called Hippies to Yuppies. And so we're going to start with introducing our first co-panelist. Here we have Sarah Relyea. Is I saying it right? Great. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sarah first. Sarah is the author of Playground Zero. This is a novel set in the late 1960s. Sarah grew up in Berkeley, and at that time, that was during the countercultures movement. As a young girl, she went to the infamous Altamont concert and frequented Telegraph Avenue. She would soon swap California's psychedelic scene for studying English at Harvard. A PhD who has taught at universities in New York and Taiwan, Sarah is also the author of Outsider Citizens, the remaking of post-war identity in Wright, Beauvoir, and Baldwin, published by Routledge. Along the way, she has worked as a literary manager for an off-Broadway theater and a test developer for the Educational Testing Service. Sarah lives in Brooklyn, New York, and continues to spend time in Northern California, where she and her partner enjoy the Redwood Canyons. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this historical novel that she's written. Here is a brief description of Playground Zero. The Rayson family consists of two straight-laced parents, Tom and Marion, 12-year-old Alice, and her older brother, Kurt. In the late 1960s, they drive across the country to move from Washington, D.C. to Berkeley, California. At the same time, Jim and Valerie, siblings, are shipped out by bus from Colorado to San Francisco to live with their radical father, Dan Dupree. Dan runs a jeans store while the hippies take over a park near Telegraph Avenue, and his children run wild. This is the summer of love, also in the 60s, and it was the perfect environment for free schools, such as the Other Path School, run by a charismatic Joel, where the agenda is loose and based on staging happenings. Family units form and break up, forging new definitions of what is a family and who are friends. And now we're going to have Sarah read a brief excerpt from her novel.
Hi, and thanks for being here tonight. I'm going to read a short scene from the opening, the opening road trip of the novel. The family's driving west from Washington, D.C. to Berkeley. The book takes place over 3 years. In this early scene, Alice is 10 years old, and the family is in Santa Fe. Alice abandoned the bench as her father approached, unfolding a map to show her mother a place called Los Alamos. As her mother turned away, frowning, her brother ran up with a handful of baseball cards, torn already from the wrapper. A few moments later, they were heading for the car. Then came the narrow, swerving road up the canyon to a small town, so far from anything that had hovered there, a sandbar under the sky, surrounded by faraway swells of land. They passed fences of barbed wire, guarding seemingly deserted buildings. Her father meandered around, peering one way and then another, as though searching for something he'd lost. Her mother rode beside him, scowling through her window, hands folded grimly in her lap. The sun glared. The parched breeze rushed through the window, rubbing Alice's face sandpaper smooth. No one had told her why they were here, and she sensed there would be no response if she inquired. Maybe there was no reason. Maybe they'd come only to see sandbar and sky and then leave. They'd done so before on summer beaches. Why then was her mother so upset to be here? Alice opened her book and began to read, but the canyon road had made her queasy, and the words hovered meaningless before her eyes. She closed her book. She whispered to her brother, "Where are we?" He shot her a glance. "Dummy, it's where they made the bomb." In the pause that followed, her father murmured inaudibly, and her mother groaned, "I just feel so ashamed." Soon they returned as they had come, through the canyon towards Santa Fe and then beyond, reaching Gallup at dusk. As they approached Gallup, her father reached an arm over the frayed seat cover and dropped a pack of baseball cards on her leg. "You should have your own," he remarked with a sidelong glance. Later in the motel, Alice tore the wrapper from the cards and pretended to study the numbers on the back, the way her brother would do. "Who'd you get?" he demanded, eyes gleaming, urgent and chummy. She showed him slyly as though flashing a poker hand. "Trade ya," he cajoled. Kurt searched through her cards, humming to himself as he replaced a few with players he already had.
Okay, great. Now we're going to do this crazy thing. I'm actually going to turn the laptop around so you can see our next panelist while I talk to him. Here we have Michael Bourne. Here you are.
Hey,
He's,
hello, everybody.
he's phoning in from Vancouver. So let me tell you a little bit about Michael. Michael is the author of Blithedale Canyon, published by Regal House in 2022. He is a longtime contributing editor for Poets and Writers magazine, and he has written for the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, what else? The Economist, Literary Hub, and Salon. Michael's fiction has appeared in more than a dozen literary magazines, including December, the Southampton Review, and Tin House. He grew up in Northern California and now lives in Vancouver, Canada, with his wife and son. So, Michael, I'm going to tell them a little bit about your book now.
Cool.
Okay, cool. All right, so here's the gist of Blithedale Canyon. 29-year-old Trent Cushman, a former high school star athlete, has come back to his high school neighborhood after a stint in rehab in prison. He lives with his mother and stepfather, Stan, a wealthy capitalist. Trent's working class grandparents had run the local Cushman Shoes before it was turned into a Starbucks. Desperate for work, Trent ends up at a family deli grocery store owned by the Papadakis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, you got it.
Trying to go cold turkey from drink and drugs. Trent has also run into his high school crush, Suze. She's a mother of two small boys, who is in the process of trying to divorce her absentee husband. Trent's mother lives in the seriously wealthy part of Blithedale Canyon, while Suze lives in Projects for the White People, the nearby Shelter Ridge neighborhood. The difference between the two classes puts pressure on Trent to learn how to get clean, stand on his own, and atone for his past crimes. And now I'm going to have Michael read an excerpt from his book. Take it away, Michael.
Okay. as I'm sure Sarah can tell you, it's hard to pick 3 minutes out of a book. But that was what I was asked to do, and so that's what I'm gonna do. I thought I would do the section that talks about the projects for white people, and I should tell you um, that, of course, people in Mill Valley Mill Valley is a real place, as is Blithedale Canyon, and people from Mill Valley have read this. And the most recent event I was at, a woman that I grew up with, who grew up with a single mom in Shelter Ridge, was horribly offended that I called it the projects for white people. But I swear a kid actually said that to me one time, and so I stole it. So I thought what I would do is I would read just a quick scene here where he's first sort of coming from where his mom lives up on the hill in Blithedale Canyon, and going to see where the woman he's in love with, this woman Suze, lives with her children. So this is just sort of a setting scene here. When I was a kid, Blithedale Ridge was where the cops and school teachers lived, and where single moms ended up when the alimony check stopped. The projects for white people, we called it. I hadn't been up there in years, probably not since the last time I dropped Suze off for school. And as I drove up the hill to where she lived now, a few blocks over from her mom's old condo, I couldn't get over how sunny and gorgeous it all was. This was the projects? The units were all freshly painted with plenty of trees and open space between them. And the long row of condos that crested the ridge looked out over the bay, past Sausalito and Alcatraz to downtown San Francisco, the tops of the skyscrapers hovering Oz-like over the curling fog. But I was older now, and I saw in a way I never had before what set Shelter Ridge apart from the rest of Mill Valley. Coming in from East Blithedale, I passed Longfellow Road and Millay Place before turning on to Kipling Drive. From there, I cut across Chaucer Court and Dickens Court to Thoreau Circle, where Suze lived. Maybe this wows him in Modesto or in the commuter suburbs of North Marin, but not in Mill Valley, not the part my mother lived in anyway. In Blithedale Canyon, you could leave a Barbara Kingsolver novel on the coffee table or put on the Kronos Quartet for your dinner guests, but you didn't name your streets after them. And if you drove a jet black Mini Cooper, you didn't show it off all glossy and finely tuned in your driveway. No, you bitched about the funky British transition and left your sweaty tennis things in a pile in the back seat. This was the trick to being rich, Mill Valley style, the trick I'd watched my mother learn and relearn every day. You had to have everything: the right house, the right clothes, the right politics, the right friends, and then you had to pretend you didn't give a damn about any of it. That in truth, the truth be told, you hadn't noticed you had all this money. That was what Shelter Ridge was for, to do the noticing and the envying. On Shelter Ridge, the units had been built at the same time from the same plans, and the residents were falling all over themselves to make up for it, keeping the gardens just a little too neat, washing their cars a little too often, displaying their flat screen TVs a little too prominently in their front windows. If I hadn't been raised the way I had as a poor kid in a rich town, I might not have picked up that special odor of desperation the merely comfortable emit in the presence of the truly wealthy. But I had been raised that way. As I pulled up in front of Suze's condo, I saw her Volvo in the driveway with its free Tibet sticker on the bumper. It hit me for the first time how shaky her foothold was in our hometown. The condo, the car, the suit she'd been wearing that first day at Howie's, all of it was designed to make Suze look like the kind of person who belonged in Mill Valley, which of course marked her as exactly the kind of person who didn't belong.
Ah, very nice, very nice. So here we have an interesting environment. We have Sarah's book, where we have young people moving to the Bay Area in the 60s. And then we have Michael's book, decades later, talking about this class system. So I think the thing that's going to be interesting in this conversation is we're going to talk about what brought these people to this area. But let's start with Sarah, and I'm going to ask her the first question, and then I'll turn the computer around to her. So Sarah, your book, Playground Zero, starts off with a family traveling across the country during the civil unrest of the 1960s and the event of the atomic bomb. How did you pick this route that the family drove? And have you ever traveled that route yourself?
Yeah, the Racines are moving west. Racines are moving west by car in the summer of 1968. Tom, a Washington lawyer, has taken a new job in the Bay Area. I have traveled the cross-country route in both directions through the Southwest, which is the route that the Racines take. But I planned their journey to suggest certain themes going forward in the book. Most of the road scenes take place in the Southwest. The family goes through New Mexico, Albuquerque, then up to Santa Fe in the passage I read for some sightseeing. From there, Tom takes them on a detour up the mountain into Los Alamos. The Racines have never been west before. I wanted to take them through a classic American landscape, but one that is also strange and foreboding. The Southwestern route is, I think, if you see it for the first time, it's kind of mythic, it's geologically stunning, and it's overwhelming for this, and defamiliarizing for this family of Easterners. Marion, the mother, sees it as a kind of moonscape. Now, I used the specific bit of the detour up to Los Alamos to introduce a really significant issue and problem in the 60s, which was the bomb, the threat of nuclear war. The bomb and ongoing research gave rise to the anti-war movement before the Vietnam War. It was kind of present before, during, and after. UC Berkeley was a major player with the Lawrence Lab and the cyclotron, and figures such as Oppenheimer, Ernest Lawrence, Edward Teller. So the term generation gap, for example, which was made famous in the 60s, was coined by the anthropologist Margaret Mead. She used that term to refer to the gap between the younger generation who was growing up with the threat of the bomb and awareness of the bomb, and then older generation who had not, who had grown up in relative innocence. Fear of the bomb hung over the 60s. I belong to the duck and cover generation. It was in the culture and it was in our nightmares. It was in the popular music as well. I remember several songs. The Grateful Dead did a song called Morning Dew. There was the song Wooden Ships by Crosby, Stills and Nash. Those are both kind of, after the nuclear war songs, although I didn't quite realize that when I heard them at the age of 10. Then there was the Jefferson Airplane album, Crown of Creation. The cover has a mushroom cloud with the band kind of rising out of the cloud. So I framed the story with references to Los Alamos and the Lawrence Lab. On the way to Berkeley, the Racines pass by Los Alamos. Then at the end, they're leaving Berkeley again by car with a new dad at the wheel. And the new dad drives them up past the Lawrence Lab, then down along Telegraph Avenue for their last glance at 1960s Berkeley.
Great, thank you. So Michael, I want to talk about how your protagonists arrive on the scene. It seems that your character, Trent, and he's the product of a broken home, is rediscovering the Bay Area alongside with his mom's wealthy lifestyle, even though the two of them have experienced poverty after, living else after the dad deserted them. So this idea, Michael, that you had of writing Trent's family's background, did you have in mind first that Trent got in trouble and went away and came back? Or were you writing about his struggles to belong to the upper class first?
So yeah, I mean, I first of all, I just want to say that the Trent's family he's not me, right? So his family is really rooted in Mill Valley. They've been there for several generations, but my family isn't. And actually, I took that drive when I was like 3 in the late 60s with my parents from the East to San Francisco as well. So I know that story quite well. That's kind of the classic California story. In terms to answer your question, which came first, I mean, I actually one of the reasons I wanted to read that particular passage was that the line about being a rich kid in a wealthy town. Mill Valley, I don't know if people know where that is or know what it is. It's a real place, and it is exactly like your promo says. It's went from hippies to yuppies. in a generation. It was when my parents moved there, and when I was a kid, it was kind of where the Summer of Love overflow went to, and it was that and college professors and then over time it's become this extraordinarily wealthy place to the point that I find it somewhat almost unrecognizable from where I grew up. So I wanted to, there's kind of three parts to this book. One is this guy trying to get sober. That's a big part of it. Then there's this love story. And then I also wanted to write a book that kind of captured a place in a time in Mill Valley. And so I thought that the way to do that was, like a rich guy wouldn't quite get it. It had to be somebody that was both of the place and not of it, could sort of see it in a way that they more the wealthier and more normal people of that town really would never see it. So that was the conceit going in, and then I cooked up a whole lot of plot stuff to make that happen. But that was my real goal, was to get this guy in a place where he could tell you what it's actually like. In other words, like if you were to drive into Mill Valley, you would see the way that it is presenting itself to the world, which is, let's be perfectly honest, a gorgeous place. But there's also a whole lot more there, that there's layers to it that you really have to be from there to get. And you have to have gone up and down the class scale to feel it.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a great way to open that up. And I think it's so interesting that you're both writing about these disenfranchised families that have moved to this, land of honey in the Northern California area. Sarah, you said, I was reading in your bio to everyone that you had actually lived in San Francisco as a child. Were your experiences anything like that of the people in your book?
Well, yeah, I mean, I lived in Berkeley. My family lived in Berkeley from 1967 through 1971. I was 9 through 13 years old. And the general flow of events in Alice Racin's life, in terms of her schools, the lure of Telegraph Avenue and People's Park, the whole Bay Area music scene and all the psychedelic posters associated with it, that has roots in my own life and experience. There was an amazing music scene at the time. I could wander over to a park called Provo Park, which was across from the high school, to hear local bands perform on Saturdays. The Fillmore West was across the bay. And like my character Alice, I went there with other sixth graders. Berkeley's a very small city. It's centered on the university and the campus. And though my parents were not academics, our house was very near the campus and Telegraph Avenue. It was easy walking distance. So I spent a lot of time wandering around the places, the sites that appear in Playground Zero. Sproul Plaza, the Greek Theater, these are sites on the campus, the Eucalyptus Grove, also the jeans store that appears in the book, and the Cafe Med, which was a kind of landmark cafe. I love the idea of using Berkeley as a kind of stage set. It's an incredibly cinematic place. I mean, very interesting and also very beautiful. In one of my scenes, Alice and her young sixth grade pals drop acid. So I took them along Telegraph Avenue, through the campus, up to the Greek Theater, where they climb the hill and then end up running down through mud. There's a second LSD scene at the Fillmore West with its dark, low-ceilinged room and the light show above the stage. I thought of the two scenes as heaven and hell. That was an idea I got from an Aldous Huxley book called Heaven and Hell. It was a 1950s essay about psychoactive substances and mysticism. It was, he was kind of an author that was widely read in the 60s. So my memory led me to places and events that intrigued me, and then I researched them for the book. I made research trips and took photographs. I read books, about Berkeley history and so on. So some of the events and people are real, but I was using them freely, creatively to tell a particular story.
Great. And you, Michael, you were saying that your family had actually lived in the Mill Valley area.
Oh, yeah, I'm from there.
It's so interesting. Michael's book takes place during 9/11. Here's, we have Sarah's book taking place during the Summer of Love, a traumatic experience. And here's Michael's book taking place during 9/11. Were your family still there during that period of time?
Yeah, my family was still my family lived, I grew up in Mill Valley. And though, left, I haven't lived there in 40 years, but anyway, my family was there until both my parents died in the last couple of years. Um, yeah, and I was not. Um, but I was really interested. It's funny how 9/11 was in the book from the beginning. I just knew that they would eventually, like, I didn't write it, but I just knew I would get there. Said it in the summer of 2001. I was kind of hoping the readers would like be reading along and not really paying attention to the year, and then like suddenly, whoa, 9/11, of course. I wanted to kind of come out of nowhere. The thing that I was trying to get at was the surreality of that moment historically. If you weren't actually, I was in the Virginia suburbs, so I was close to it, but it was a television event. It was a TV show. And I wanted to kind of, it was even like that times 100. There's a scene where he's, like freaking out, like, should he join the army? What should he do? We're under attack. And then he looks out and it's like this beautiful Tuesday morning and it's the fogs hanging on the ridge lines, and it's just gorgeous. And he's thinking, like, it's this real sort of disconnect. And I wanted to play with that because, of course, he's this like train wreck. He's tearing up everybody's lives, and yet everything around him is just fine, and he's trying to look so good. So I was trying to play with that, but I also just wanted to kind of come out of nowhere for the reader that they forgot that this was this huge paradigm ripping event.
I think it's so great that both of these authors have taken these sort of like national events and turned them into very personal stories, coming of age stories. Speaking
Right.
of which, Sarah, you have these two different families, the families of Alice and Kurt versus the families of Jim and Valerie. Can you tell us the difference between those two families and how did you come up with that conflict between them?
Yeah, so the core of Playground Zero revolves around the racing's daughter, Alice, and her search for a group that will give her some sense of belonging. She's new in Berkeley. We soon see that her school and family are both pretty dysfunctional, and she's lonely and looking for pals. Alice and her brother Kurt are not close. The other family, the Dupre family, Jim and Valerie and their father, Dan, are based on people that I knew. As a sixth grader, I met the models for Jim and Valerie on Telegraph Avenue, which was kind of the hippie scene in Berkeley. And I hung out with them and some other kids for 2 or 3 months. They were on their way to becoming street kids. The father was a hippie and a local activist. He had a jeans shop on Telegraph Avenue, a seemingly endless supply of drugs. And he was known as the founder of People's Park. People's Park, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it was a central event in the Berkeley counterculture. And it features prominently in my book, mainly through this Dupre family. So I made up a backstory for Jim and Valerie using themes and images from fairy tales. We meet them in Colorado where they're living with their mom. They're a bit Hansel and Gretel-like. She gets angry and sends them off to Berkeley to live with their activist father, Dan, a man they barely remember. Once Jim and Valerie arrive in Berkeley, I put them in the middle of the Telegraph Avenue hippie scene and the People's Park riot. So I'm telling that part of the story mainly through their eyes. They have a kind of odd status. On the one hand, they're neglected by Dan, their father, who leaves them to scrounge meals at a local commune. On the other hand, because they're Dan's kids, they have a kind of protected status on Telegraph Avenue, which otherwise would be a pretty dangerous place. The two are close, Jim and Valerie. They hang out together by their father's store, and everyone there knows them. So for a time, this wild and free life seems to be working for them. they're kind of the polar opposite of Alice and Kurt economically, but also, in terms of they hang out together. Kurt and Alice barely speak. So I wanted to bring the middle class racins with, the uptight parents up against far out Berkeley, where things are spinning out of control, because that's such an essential aspect of what was going on. By the late 60s, there was a critical mass of single moms on food stamps, bohemians and hardcore activists, some of them with kids, a lot of teenage runaways, and then rubbing shoulders with all of these people were professors' kids hanging out on Telegraph and getting drawn into the drug scene.
Well, that's the great thing about both these books, is that they have such contrast between the haves and the have-nots. So, Michael, I'd like to bring up the situation that was happening commercially, and that there were a lot of those small-time businesses like the Cushman shoes being swallowed up by national chains, changing the entire feel of Blithedale. And Blithedale is not a real community, right? This is based on Mill Valley.
Blithedale Canyon totally exists. Yeah.
Oh, right.
It's a real
Okay.
place.
But
Yeah.
was this climate of rich versus poor, was that changing during the 9/11 era, or was this something in pre-development before the 1990s?
Yeah. So again, the core of the book is this love story and the guy fighting addiction and all the rest of it. And there's this other story about the town, which I really wanted to get right and get a story of it. So, like I said, it was a sort of Mill Valley was a classic, sort of 50s community, ticky-tacky little houses, and then nestled in a really pretty place. And then during the 60s and 70s, it was kind of overrun by like I said, the Summer of Love folk, and then it started to really change about the time I was finishing high school, and it became this very, very wealthy place. And so much of this book was researched, if the word is correct, from being from the place, but also my first job out of college was as a newspaper reporter in my hometown for a little newspaper called the Mill Valley Record, which no longer exists, sadly. And I covered the city council, and I covered planning and zoning, and I was the one reporter for the entire newspaper. I wrote the whole thing all week. And the big story that the year that I was there, which sounds preposterous now, is that the town was in an absolute uproar over Along's Drugs moving into what had been a family-owned grocery store. And you would have thought, the Russians were coming. I mean, it was just like this horrible invasion, and they fought it and they fought it. And I wrote like 50 million stories about this. So, that was very much a story. And of course they lost. Long's Drugs came in, and now there are not one, but two Whole Foods in that town. And the place is wall-to-wall chain stores. And it was trying to cling to, and that's a story. People talk about gentrification as happening in poor neighborhoods, but it happens in wealthy places too, where you take the thing that a town is, and then you sort of bottle it and market it and turn it. And so there's a line that Trent has at one point, that Mill Valley is turned into a yuppified theme park of itself. And that's, if you go to a place like Mill Valley, that's what you see. Everything feels it's like downtown Disneyland. Remember that little main street in Disneyland? It's sort of like that. Everything is looks, because the original architecture is still there and all the little shops, but they're all kind of, pole tested, yuppie things. Lots of doggy daycare, about 6 places to get coffee, and the head shop is now a jewelry shop and things like that. And so that it was very much a fight that was happening. And the grocery store in the story is this family business that's trying to move with the times and finding that really difficult to do. How do you stay in place in a place that's shifting so radically?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and I think it's so wonderful that both of these authors have lived this experience of these environments changing. And that's why the reading for me was so authentic. because I really felt that. Sarah, I wanted to ask you about the violence that was happening in Berkeley at that time. I mean, we have the police actually campaigning violence against the citizens. Were you actually part of that scene, as they say?
Well, I think you're referring to the People's Park.
The People's
Park events.
right.
I was actually a fifth grader at the time, but some fifth graders were involved. But yeah, so I mean, demonstrations and protests occurred in Berkeley very frequently throughout the '60s. I mean, I came to see it almost. I mean, in the years since, I've come to almost see it as a game of provocation between the police and the protesters. And some of these protests occurred on Telegraph Avenue, where the street people joined in, and things tended to become more violent. In 1969, during the events known as People's Park, yeah, things turned deadly. Definitely, it was very. I'll give more detail about that. So I remember hearing and reading about these demonstrations. I mean, everybody, you couldn't live in Berkeley and not be acutely aware of them. And many teenagers got caught up in them. Kids would go from the high school or even the junior high school to some of these protests. Now, my parents had the Berkeley Barb around the house. That was the local underground paper. My brother watched news on the TV with, at that time, very graphic footage from Vietnam. That was much too horrifying for me. I mean, it literally gave me nightmares. So instead, I read the Barb, which was kind of splashy and countercultural. Like Alice, I got drawn in by the reporting and the photographs and the stories about People's Park, which was presented as like the creation of this kind of idyllic garden, and then its savage destruction by the police and the National Guard. It was like this very heartrending story for an 11-year-old girl. Basically what happened is in the spring of 1969, a group of people took over a vacant lot near Telegraph Avenue in the campus. The land was owned by the university, and these people created a park on it. Hundreds of people participated. Some were students, some were street people, some were local residents and housewives and little kids in strollers. After about a month, the university sent in the police in the middle of the night to shut the whole thing down. After that, there were absolutely huge protests. And these events, this was all thoroughly documented, mostly by people sympathetic to the counterculture and the park. And a lot of this material was published in the Berkeley Barb. And today you can see the photographs on the website Getty Images, which has a lot of news photography from the past. It's a great resource. You can see the young men hurling rocks, National Guardsmen with their rifles and fixed bayonets, because they were there for about 10 days, 2 weeks. And then, the fenced and uprooted park. The police had been given orders to shoot. They were supposedly using birdshot, but a man on one of the roofs on Telegraph Avenue was pumped full of birdshot and died. And there were lots of hospitalizations. So that it was a very violent event. I think, if you think about some of the riots in the 60s, in particularly in Black areas, there was actually much more violence. Many more people died. But I think, in a white community, this was kind of unusual. It was kind of a novelty. It was before Kent State. So anyway, in Playground Zero, Alice gets caught up in the Barb's reporting about the park. They were kind of mythologizing the park even as it was happening. This Garden of Eden atmosphere, this camaraderie with topless women dancing around the bonfire and so on. And then it's all uprooted and destroyed. So yeah, I kind of researched, I read through all the Barb issues, which is in the New York Public Library, the ones that report about the park and the demonstrations that appear in my book. The New York Times had articles, their history books about Berkeley in the 60s. So I used the research kind of for the larger parameters about how and when, the details of the larger picture. And there is some controversy about how much violence the protesters were using. For example, whether they were actually dropping things off the roofs on Telegraph Avenue onto the police, which I have someone doing in one of my scenes. And I kind of went with that more violent account because I'm showing the events through the eyes of these street kids, Jim and Valerie Dupre. And you know, when the police come in to take over the park, Jim and Valerie are sleeping there in their sleeping bags. It's kind of home to them, and they're devastated by its loss. So in those scenes, there's street kids literally, you know, in a war for the park.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And speaking of dealing with hard issues, Michael, I wanted to talk with you just a little bit about your main protagonist, Trent. He's smart and he's hardworking, but his addictions really seem to be keeping him out of the loop to be successful. And his direct boss at the deli where he works seems to be a younger version of him with Trent's problems. Did you mean to write someone who was echoing the same sort of struggles in that stratosphere?
Well, I certainly meant for the two to chime, right? And I'm not going to, go into the details of why that might be so. You'd have to read the book to find out. But um, I do think that their sins are a little different, right? I mean, that what is causing them to do things that they really ought not to be doing is really different. I mean, Gianni, who is the guy so there's this small grocery store that's a kind of a old line business in this little town. Um, and he's the sort of heir apparent. He's the son of the guy that runs it, and he's trying desperately to save it and save it from itself in a way, and sort of with it save the town, right? If he can keep this little business going, that's his notion of it. And that so his sin is overweening ambition, right? He can't really do what he wants to do, and so he kind of cheats. Trent is as you say, his uh the things that are holding him back are really a part of his personality and a part of his makeup. Um, and he is battling from me, the core of the book is really this story of a man who is a young man who is a decent person. He's a good guy who's doing bad things, right? And and can see himself doing it, can watch himself, and you watch him. My conceit for one of my rules for the book was that Trent lies to literally everybody. I mean, like he just lies and lies and lies and lies, but he never lies to himself, and he never lies to the reader ever. He's absolutely truthful, and not to his benefit either. I mean, he says things about himself that are not so pleasant. So he is completely honest at some level and a complete liar. And I wanted to try to write a book about a man who is trying to overcome that, and not he's destroyed the lives of so many people in this kind of careless way, right? It's not that he wants to hurt them, it's just that they're in his way. And so, now he finds somebody who he actually loves. And can he fix himself? Can he stop doing this before he tears up her life too, and the lives of her kids and everything? So I think they're really different. I think they do similar things, but Gianni is trying to build something badly, perhaps not 100% honestly. But he's trying to build something. Trent is just trying not to tear the world apart.
Yeah, I thought
his own world.
When this character, he seems like he's going to get together, he's almost going to get there, and then you write these scenes where you just go, oh no, 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 really.
Yeah, well, my conceit, I cannot tell you how many times I have gotten little notes from women friends who've read the book, or complete strangers who say, I dated that guy. Right. I dated that guy all through my 20s, and I tried to fix him and it just didn't work. Or, he's my cousin. Or, my nephew is going through something like this right now. I think it's a really, really a much more common story than we'd like to admit. I think that guy, and the thing that I, that these people say and that I sense is that the people who are going through this are not necessarily bad people. They're just doing destructive things, often self-destructive, but other people get in the way. There's a lot of collateral damage, and they're heedless, and they're self-centered, and they just can't stop doing this thing. And that's kind of what I was trying to put you inside the head of this guy, so you can sort of see the mental processes that get to doing these frankly stupid things.
It was frightening, and he was very stupid sometimes. So let's get back to Sarah. And part of your social bringing awareness about not only the police, but I'd like to talk to you about the integration in the schools during that time, because it doesn't seem to have been a very successful accomplishment. Why do you think there was so much hostility between the students? And does it seem as though this environment is still present in schools there today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the 6 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Berkeley began a program of desegregating the elementary schools using busing. Kids were kind of bused both ways, from Black neighborhoods to white schools and vice versa. So Alice is attending a newly integrated school where she's a 5th and 6th grader. These are actually the least invented scenes in the book. I'm describing problems that I personally encountered and found very discouraging. And I came away with a real sense of failure. In the book, Alice is tormented at school and she dreams of escaping. And these problems kind of, I think to a large degree, propel her story. Just as a little background, at this time, Berkeley had de facto housing segregation and very segregated elementary schools until 1968. At that point, the city adopted a plan to integrate the elementary schools. I was bused to a formerly Black school, and with the new plan, the school's demographics were about 50% white, 50% Black. It's really no secret that in 1968, race relations in this country were really bad and always have been. There was a huge sense of frustration at that moment. The civil rights movement was becoming the Black Power movement. The Panthers had a headquarters in Oakland where they were arming the Black community. And the Black Power movement largely rejected the whole concept of integration. So this was kind of like a collision course. And for Black kids on the playground, as I remember, I mean, the big thing was really James Brown and Black pride. Many of them came from working class families with roots in the Jim Crow South. And I think they were kind of breaking out of that really, really repressive culture. On the other hand, many of the white students came from kind of high status academic or professional families. So these were two groups that really had nothing in common and had literally never been face to face in a room before. There was mutual ignorance and a lot of distrust. I think, some things made the situation, worse than it might have been or more difficult. There was poor planning regarding basic safety in the school. The hallways and bathrooms were frankly dangerous. Like Alice, I personally experienced really a lot of verbal harassment, also hitting and even groping in the hallways. One day I was badly beaten, and this is a scene in the book that it happens to Alice. I was badly beaten while walking home, and a group of kids from my school gathered around to cheer on my adversary. My parents weren't particularly helpful about any of this. They were very committed ideologically to integration and just didn't want to hear about it. I think other issues, the classrooms were hard to run. There was no tracking. So the teachers had a wide range of levels in the same class. Instead of preparing one math or reading lesson, they were preparing 3 or 4 to present to different groups, within the class. One example I remember was I was given, as a 5th grader, I was given Catcher in the Rye to read. The others, I don't even know what they were reading. There were no lessons about the books because everyone was reading something different. We simply read to ourselves. I got really used to doing my own thing, but that's not, what school is really about. Most 11 and 12-year-olds they're looking for a peer group. That's really what matters to them. But, this school situation had disrupted all the peer groups. In response, I think not surprisingly, the Black students felt that we were intruders. And all the students were busy bonding with their own race and imposing a kind of self-segregation on their social, their social lives within the school. That's simply what they knew.
Speaking of not hostile environments, but in Michael's book, there's the fancy neighborhood, but then we have the looming presence of San Quentin prison. In addition to, there's AA meetings and there's these long car rides to these lookout points, which seem very desolate and somewhat hostile. Was it your intent to write such a harsh environment where you have someone like Trent working for minimum wage at Howie's Burger, and then these rich people who have personal shoppers? It just seems like such a harsh division between the classes.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to, I mean, I think, listen to what Sarah's talking about. I think, in some parts of America, the divisions are really, really obvious. In some areas like the suburbs, the divisions are very carefully papered over, and they're not so obvious. But you peel back the layer or a couple layers, and you see it. And that was kind of what I was trying to do. I mean, he is somebody who is kind of at the margins, and in the story, he has committed a number of felonies at the beginning of before the book starts, and he's out on probation. But if he violates probation, which he is doing basically every day, if he gets caught at it, he's going to end up at San Quentin. So that's a sort of totem for him of, like, driving by it every day. And if you've ever been north of the Golden Gate Bridge and driven along Highway 101, you see the San Quentin prison in the middle of this kind of lovely area. It's actually on a really pretty, San Quentin Point is really quite pretty. And there's this iconic prison. So yeah, I wanted to the bunkers that he goes to. Actually, I was trying to make those pretty. That's a gorgeous place out there in the Marin Headlands. Um, but yeah, there's an undercurrent of the seaminess underneath all this. And listening to Sarah talk, I mean, I'm from Marin, and it's pretty lily white, but and in places like Marin, race is pushed off to the side, but it's there. It's less of it's less black than it used to be, but there is a city called Marin City, which when I was growing up was a black neighborhood. It was poor. And it was and the racial divisions at my high school were so kept under wraps. We were pretending it didn't exist, but boy, they were there, and all you had to do was just keep your eyes open a little bit, and you could see it. And that, I think, was, I don't really delve into the racial issue so much in this book, though I could have. But I think that idea of, like, there's underneath all these places, there is an unsettling element to it all that you're not seeing when you drive down Miller Avenue in Mill Valley.
We just got a couple more questions for our authors. Sarah, one of your last questions says, you have this alternate school called The Other Path. It almost seems like a Lord of the Flies setup. Were there other alternate schools there that were this unstructured? I mean, it just seemed crazy how free it was.
That's a great question. The answer is yes. There was not only, I spent a year at an alternative school as a 7th grader. That was the model for Other Paths. It's definitely Other Paths, not The Other Paths.
Oh, sorry.
And there were several others, as well as a lot of alternate programs within the regular schools. I think that the school I attended, I think the background's interesting, so I'll say a bit about that. It grew out of a teacher training project that was organized by Alan Capro, who developed the performances known as Happenings. And Herb Cole, who was at that time well known as an alternative schools, he was part of the alternative schools movement. So for a year in 1968 and 1969, the project was run out of a storefront in Berkeley and funded by the Carnegie Corporation. Teachers and students would drop in after school. Capro obviously brought a kind of avant-garde arts focus. For example, he had junior high students doing happening style events around Berkeley. They would go out with chairs and put the chairs down and sit there for a while and interact with the public, or they would do these things that were kind of interactive. Then they would go back and analyze the way people responded. So that was kind of the curriculum they were developing. Then in 1969, Herb Cole got permission from the school district to set up an off-site school, 7th through 12th grade. Although Capro was no longer involved, the school kept some of the avant-garde arts focus. For example, the year that I attended, which was the year after that, there was an improv class called Guerrilla Theater, where students would kind of plan happenings. And sometimes the students would then kind of start doing their own thing. I remember one girl who would get together a group of kids, they'd put on, clown makeup on their faces. They would go into supermarkets and they would sort of start accosting at this time there were sort of traditional housewives were the shoppers, and they would start accosting people with, weird and maybe sort of aggressive questions until someone called the manager, or I think in one case, the police. So this, things kind of developed. But Berkeley itself was almost like a permanent happening. Everyone was trying out new and strange ways of performing everyday life. So I thought the happening was a great metaphor for this, this constant defying of norms. And in the chapters about other paths, I created a couple of happening style scenes. One of them is an improv class where Joel, the teacher, asks the students to, choose a form of madness and act it out. So soon you have 20 students, in the room, saying and doing really bizarre things. And that ends with one boy throwing a chair through the window. And another scene during a school retreat, the same boy leads a happening. And he sees it as a kind of rebellion against one of the teachers who's been having sex with a particularly intriguing girl, and the boy is incredibly jealous. So, with all of this avant-garde play that was going on, I think in my book, instead of moving the culture forward, I kind of see it as it's kind of leading back to some of the age-old human problems like jealousy and so on. So if anything, my scenes at other paths are I think they're almost too tame for what was actually going on. I won't go into all the details, but just as a final comment, there really are some things that you can't make up. In 1971, the school I'm describing and all of these other alternative programs in Berkeley was chosen for federal funding as part of an experimental schools program that ran for 5 years and $6 million. The idea that the feds wanted to create they wanted to apply research and development, that methodology, that's normally associated with the fields of space and defense. They wanted to apply it to bringing about comprehensive change in the schools. I really don't think that they knew they were funding Lord of the Flies, but.
Well, speaking of, here's Trent. He's the high school star athlete. And I would, you never think that the guy who's got it all going on in high school is going to go away to prison. So when you were writing this other life, these characters that you came up with, Michael, the scary former AA guy who was the priest, there's a possible child molester, drug dealers. How did you think of Trent being in this milieu after he'd gotten out of prison?
Well, again, first of all, just as a sidelight, I'm from California, and I went to I went to public schools, and I went to the softer, cuddly versions of what Sarah's describing. But my 70s schooling was deeply weird. There was a lot of this really, really silly stuff going on. And we somehow survived it, but man, the 70s was not a good era for education, early childhood education. But anyway, in terms of he's recently gotten out of not out of prison. He's been out in county jail. His his stepfather's money, keeps him out of actually doing the 3 to 5 that he should be doing. But when you when you're in that system, once you leave it, there is you're in a different world. And so yeah, he's working at fast food places because there's no place else that'll take him with a felony on his record. And he needs help. He finally realizes he needs help. He doesn't think so for a long time. And the only person that he kind of trusts, and I think this is a dynamic that's very real for people who are addicts and trying to get clean, is you got to find somebody who's really been there, who knows what they're talking about. It isn't just selling, some easy thing. They really, and so yeah, so he seeks out this former priest, who's been spent his time in prison. And that's a world that, again, I think the suburbs covers all that up, but I don't know that those people are still living in Mill Valley. I mean, how would they pay rent? But because I don't know anybody who could live in Mill Valley. My own family couldn't live in Mill Valley if we tried to live there now. But they definitely were there when I was younger. And there was a whole, sort of they come out at night,
Yeah.
So yeah, that was, I was trying to capture all that. And also I want to make it clear that the book isn't like this, underground Mill Valley. It's a love story. It's not all, bad guys doing bad things.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up a little bit here. So in case there's some questions, I have one last question for both you and Sarah. Well, actually just two. So I'll start with you, Michael. Did you know when you started writing this book that you were going to have your main character possibly not stay?
I mean, the logic of it kind of determined it. I'm all about, so I'm telling him, I knew from the very get-go, because the first scene starts, he meets the girl, quote unquote. So I knew I was operating in the narrative tradition of romances, right? And you can't, you have to, that has to be followed through. So I was trying to figure out an interesting way to play with that story. So I was trying to make that ending be, he has to leave to save her, in a sense. So yeah, the logic of the story, kind of like, where else. I had a friend of mine read this book, and she was like, for the last 50 pages, I was wondering how you're going to land this plane, right? And that was how I chose to land it. And I think it's the only thing that's really logical.
Yeah,
Anything else would be
yeah,
Hollywood and silly.
it's a nice beginning, that ending. And
Yeah, exactly.
so same with you, Sarah. Did you know that you wanted to write this book with your main characters going away at the end?
Well, actually, my working title was Escape from Berkeley. So I guess, I saw the story as a kind of down the rabbit hole adventure for the Racine family, and especially for Alice, as they journey through the 60s and come out the other side. And of course, we're left wondering how his experience changed them. As I mentioned, the family leaves Berkeley with a new dad at the wheel. And I think, certainly it's clear that Alice will have a lot to grapple with as she settles into a new school in the suburbs. But that's the story of the 60s, which shook up, shook up all the norms, reconfigured everything, and then seemed to fade away during the Reagan years. The Racines imagine that they're leaving Berkeley behind, but, life is really never that simple.
Okay, well,
Escape from Berkeley.
Can I stick with you and just ask you, what are you working on now?
Well, I've been working on some shorter pieces, and there's really a lot of, there's really a lot of material about this era that still interests me. I'm kind of using it as not the main story, but a backstory for something set in the present, because I'm also kind of interested in what's, things going on now.
Cool. And Michael, can you tell us, what are you working on right now?
Well, I'm happy to say I just finished a new book, a follow-up to Blithedale Canyon. It's very different. It's an eco thriller, if you will, set in this Colorado ski town. Some eco terrorists are terrorizing this small Colorado ski town, and the detectives. It's a detective novel, if you will, and the detectives are the reporters at a small town newspaper. They solve the crime.
Very cool.
That's the conceit.
Well, before we sign off, do we have any questions from the audience before? Yes.
My question is for Sarah, because I've read your book. Now, I want to read your book now. Because of the nature of this group, of course, we've been talking mostly about history. And I love your close, intelligent questions. I want you to do like me about my book. When I read Playground Zero, my impression was the main thing was that at that time might have been blissful for college age students, but terrible for 10-year-olds. That your poor girl Alice was just too young to really survive intact in that era. Was that more or less your intention for the history?
Yeah, I think definitely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, because it was certainly a great place for people in their 20s. I think college students, people in their 20s. I think for younger people, even teenagers, it was really a lot to deal with. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have time for maybe one question for Michael. Does anybody have questions for him? Okay, so our question is, when are you coming to New York so that we can see you?
I would love to. We lived in Brooklyn Heights for 9 years, and I'd come back in a heartbeat.
Okay, well, you have to look us up when you come.
I will do.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and putting up with our little technical issues, and give it up for our authors. Well done. You can find our books online, and we will keep you apprised of our next meetings. All right, everybody? Okay, take care.
That concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society and our leadership at our website, or contact us at hns-nyc@mail.com. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites in the description. Thanks for joining us.